You are far too kind to me, your grace. The east wing is quite drafty during autumn storms. We shall prepare the master guest suite for you instead.
You are a reasonable woman, Eleanor.
The heavy oak doors of Stirling Hall burst open against the violent autumn storm. Freezing rain lashed against the marble floors of the grand foyer. I stood silently at the top of the sweeping staircase. My husband, William, had finally returned after a month-long absence. But he did not return alone. A woman stood shivering beside him in a soaked velvet cloak. Her name was Victoria. She was not a guest, nor was she a distant relative seeking shelter. She was the rumor the servants had been whispering about in the dark. William shook the rain from his coat and looked up at me without a shred of guilt. He wrapped a protective arm around Victoria's waist. My gaze drifted downward. Her cloak parted just enough to reveal the undeniable swell of a pregnant belly. The air in the grand hall grew instantly suffocating. I did not scream. I did not rush down the stairs to strike his handsome, deceitful face. A woman of my station learns to swallow glass and smile. Eleanor, William's voice echoed against the cold stone walls. His tone was steady, demanding, and utterly devoid of remorse. Victoria will be staying with us in the East Wing. He spoke as if he were discussing a change in the weather. Victoria looked up at me, her eyes wide with a perfectly calculated fragility. She rested a delicate hand on her rounded stomach. It was a silent, triumphant declaration of victory. She carried the air I had not given him. The physician says she needs rest and the highest comfort, William continued. He finally broke eye contact with me, turning his attention to his damp boots. She carries my child, Eleanor. The absolute audacity of his words settled over me like a heavy winter frost. He had brought his heavily pregnant mistress into my home. He expected me to quietly step aside and play the gracious hostess. He believed my youth and beauty meant I was naive. He thought I was just another pretty ornament bought to decorate his decaying dukedom. William needed my vast family wealth to keep this rotting estate from collapsing. He assumed my money was his by right of marriage. He forgot that my father had taught me how to read a ledger before he taught me how to dance. Every chandelier, every silk drape, every crumb of bread in this house was paid for by my accounts. I slowly descended the marble staircase, my steps measured and calm. The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria shrank slightly against William's side as I approached. I stopped just 2 feet away from them. I looked at her damp hair, her flushed cheeks, and that swollen belly. Then, I looked directly into my husband's arrogant eyes. A lesser woman would have demanded an immediate divorce. A foolish woman would have thrown them out into the freezing rain. But I knew the law of this land. If I left tonight, I would forfeit the social standing and the estate. I needed time to drain him dry. I needed him to sign the papers that would shift every ounce of his debt entirely onto his own shoulders. The East Wing is quite drafty during the autumn storms, I said. My voice was as smooth as polished glass. William blinked, clearly startled by my composure. We shall prepare the master guest suite for her instead, I continued. Victoria's eyes widened in genuine shock. A slow, sickening smirk crawled across William's face. He mistook my icy restraint for complete submission. You are a reasonable woman, Eleanor, he breathed, looking incredibly relieved. I will ensure the servants attend to her every need, I promised softly. I turned my back on them and began walking toward the dining room. My heart was no longer breaking. It was hardening into a weapon. Let him have his mistress. Let them sleep in the finest bed my money could buy. Let him believe he had conquered both his dutiful wife and his passionate lover. Tomorrow, I would visit my private banker in the city. I would begin the quiet, meticulous process of withdrawing my capital. I would forge a financial trap so deep he would never see the bottom. By the time this child was born, William would not even own the clothes on his back. He brought his pregnant mistress into my home. So I decided, right then and there, to leave him with absolutely nothing but debt. The game had just begun. The next morning broke with a pale, deceptive sunlight filtering through the heavy velvet drapes of the dining room. I sat alone at the long mahogany table, sipping my tea from a delicate porcelain cup that my father had gifted me. The oppressive quiet of the manor house was soon shattered by the arrogant, heavy footsteps of my husband descending the grand staircase. William entered the room with a triumphant stride, looking thoroughly pleased with his chaotic actions from the previous night. He smiled down at me with a patronizing warmth, clearly believing he had completely broken my spirit and tamed my pride. "Victoria is still resting upstairs in the master suite," he murmured, helping himself to the silver platters of roasted meats. "The long journey through the storm was incredibly difficult for her, but she finds the accommodations acceptable." I merely nodded my head in response, offering him a perfectly calibrated, polite smile that completely concealed the freezing rage beneath my skin. "I am truly glad she is comfortable in our home, William," I replied smoothly, setting my teacup down with a soft, deliberate click. "In fact, I plan to take the carriage into the city today to arrange for a specialized physician and order the finest French silks for her comfort." His eyes immediately flashed with a familiar financial greed, exactly as I had predicted during my sleepless hours last night. "That is exceptionally generous of you, Eleanor," he said, reaching across the white linen tablecloth to pat the back of my hand. His sudden touch felt like a venomous snake slithering across my skin, but I forced myself not to pull away from his grasp. "We must always maintain the dignity and prestige of the Sterling name, after all," I whispered, withdrawing my fingers with gentle grace. An hour later, my private crest-bearing carriage was rattling loudly along the cobblestone roads leading toward the heart of the city. The rhythmic, gentle swaying of the wooden carriage did not soothe my nerves, it only focused my mind entirely on the coming financial slaughter. My true destination on this crisp autumn morning was not the high-end dressmakers or the luxury jewelry boutiques of the Upper District. I ordered the driver to stop the horses in front of a modest, unmarked brick building located near the edge of the financial sector. This quiet, unassuming office belonged to Mr. Vance, my late father's most trusted legal counselor and personal wealth manager. Mr. Vance looked up from his messy desk as I stepped inside, a look of genuine surprise flitting across his weathered, aristocratic features. "Lady Eleanor, to what do I owe this unexpected and urgent honor?" he asked, rising quickly from his chair to bow low before me. "Lock the heavy oak door, Mr. Vance," I instructed calmly, pulling off my leather riding gloves with agonizing slowness. "We have a massive, comprehensive restructuring of the Sterling estate to perform before the sun sets today." He did not question my sudden authority, he simply turned the heavy iron key in the lock and drew the thick privacy curtains shut. I sat down in the leather chair across from him and demanded to see the complete, unedited financial ledgers of my husband's dukedom. For the past 3 years of our marriage, William had handled the day-to-day accounts, blindly assuming I was far too fragile for mathematics. As Mr. Vance spread the large, yellowed parchment pages across the desk, the true depth of William's financial stupidity was finally revealed to me. My husband had not merely spent his generous monthly allowance, he had borrowed astronomical sums of money against the estate from private lenders. He had signed dozens of high-interest promissory notes under the foolish assumption that my family wealth would always exist to cover his personal losses. He currently owed hundreds of thousands of gold pieces to notorious gambling houses, failing shipping syndicates, and expensive jewelers in Paris. The missing jewelry, no doubt, was currently sitting on Victoria's dressing table upstairs in my own home. As the numbers stand today, his lordship is essentially insolvent without your signature on his accounts, milady, Mr. Vance murmured with extreme caution. If you were to suddenly stop paying his mounting bills, the aggressive creditors would dismantle this entire historic estate brick by brick. A slow, Icy smile spread across my face as I stared intently at the bleeding red ink covering the financial pages before me. Then we shall ensure the creditors only take his bricks, and absolutely none of mine, I said, my voice dripping with absolute certainty. I spent the next 3 hours instructing Mr. Vance to decouple my immense dowry completely from the ancient sterling title. We quietly and legally transferred the ownership of every valuable artwork, every family heirloom, and every acre of fertile land into a private trust. This newly established trust was registered solely under my maiden name, making it completely untouchable by any existing or future marriage contract. But protecting my own inheritance was only the first defensive portion of my meticulous strategy against my deceitful husband. I need you to draft a brand new, highly complex consolidation loan document for the Duke, I told the brilliant attorney. This specific document would offer to immediately pay off all of William's current pressing debts using a fresh injection of my family capital. However, buried deeply within the confusing legal jargon of the contract was a hidden, lethal clause designed to destroy him. By signing this new paper, William would personally assume 100% of the financial liability, releasing my family from any future claims. To his arrogant eyes, it would look like a generous, desperate gift from a doting, submissive wife trying to save her husband's social reputation. In reality, it was a financial death warrant beautifully wrapped in expensive velvet. If he signs this document, he will be entirely at the mercy of the most ruthless debt collectors if your capital is ever withdrawn, Mr. Vance warned softly. He will sign it without reading the fine print, I replied, my voice steady, cold, and completely devoid of any human warmth. He firmly believes I am terrified of losing his affection, and unearned greed always makes desperate men exceptionally blind to reality. I carefully gathered the freshly inked trap of legal documents and walked back out into the cool, refreshing city air. The invisible trap was perfectly set, the delicious cheese was in place, and the unsuspecting mouse was eagerly waiting at home for my return. William wanted a permanent legacy, he wanted a beautiful mistress, and he desperately wanted to control my vast family fortune. By the end of this eventful month, he would discover that the only thing he truly owned in this world was a mountain of unpayable debt. I stepped back into the dark carriage, feeling the first true sensation of internal peace since the autumn storm had begun. I returned to Stirling Hall just as the afternoon shadows began to stretch across the manicured lawns. The heavy silver trays of imported French silks and expensive medical tonics were carried in by the footmen. I played the role of the devoted, utterly submissive wife flawlessly. I found my husband and his mistress waiting in the grand drawing room. Victoria was lounging on my favorite chaise, sipping tea from my late mother's irreplaceable china. William stood by the roaring fireplace, looking entirely too pleased with his domestic conquest. He truly believed he had successfully broken my spirit in less than 24 hours. "You have returned from the city, Eleanor," he announced, barely looking up from his crystal brandy glass. "I have brought the absolute finest things the city has to offer for your guest," I replied with a serene smile. Victoria touched her swollen belly and offered me a sickeningly sweet, calculated smile. "You are far too kind to me, Your Grace," she murmured softly, her voice feigning absolute innocence. Her tone was heavily laced with a venomous triumph that she barely bothered to hide from me. She desperately wanted me to scream, to cry, to throw a violent tantrum like a spoiled child. She wanted to prove to William that I was emotionally unstable and completely unworthy of my noble title. I refused to give either of them the cheap satisfaction of my personal pain. Instead, I signaled for my personal maid to bring forward a silver tray holding a stack of crisp parchment. William frowned at the thick legal documents resting beside the expensive gifts. "What is this tedious paperwork doing in the drawing room?" he sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "It is a vital gift for you, my lord, and a secure future for your coming heir," I said, my voice dripping with false devotion. I calmly explained that I had visited my private banker to address his mounting financial burdens. I told him I was completely willing to use my family's massive capital to wipe away his shameful gambling debts and unpaid loans. His eyes immediately lit up with sheer, unadulterated greed. He had been dodging angry creditors for months, living in constant fear of total public ruin. "You are transferring your capital directly into my personal accounts?" he asked, stepping away from the warm fire. "I am restructuring the estate's liabilities so you will never be bothered by those aggressive lenders again," I lied beautifully. I handed him the ornate silver pen my father had given me on my wedding day. "All you need to do is sign these consolidation papers, and the debts will be handled immediately by my legal team." Victoria leaned forward on the chaise, her eyes gleaming brightly at the mere mention of vast wealth. "She finally understands her proper place, William," she whispered loud enough for me to clearly hear. William chuckled deeply, puffing out his chest as he eagerly took the heavy pen from my waiting hands. He did not read a single line of the dense, meticulously crafted legal text. He did not notice the specific clauses transferring absolute personal liability entirely onto his own name. He did not see that my massive family trust was now completely severed from the crumbling Sterling estate. He simply saw a frightened, pathetic wife trying to buy back his fading affection with gold. He scrawled his arrogant signature at the very bottom of all 3 pages. The sharp scratch of the pen on the parchment sounded exactly like a guillotine dropping in an empty courtyard. He handed the papers back to me with a smug, highly self-satisfied grin. "You have done exceptionally well today, Eleanor," he praised me as if I were a disobedient hound that had finally learned to heel. "I only wish to see the Sterling name fully secured for the future," I answered, carefully blowing on the wetting to dry it. The irreversible deed was finally done. The legal trap was completely closed, locked, and entirely unbreakable by any court in the land. William was now personally responsible for every single gold coin he owed, stripped completely of my family's financial protection. If I withdrew my backing tomorrow, he would be thrown straight into a filthy debtor's prison by the end of the week. But I was certainly not going to destroy him tomorrow. I wanted to wait until the grand autumn ball scheduled for next week. I wanted the entire high aristocracy to watch him fall violently from the very top of his high horse. "I will leave you both to rest comfortably before dinner is served," I said, bowing my head respectfully. I turned and walked out of the drawing room, taking his signed financial death warrant safely with me. As the heavy double doors closed tightly behind me, I finally allowed a genuine, predatory smile to touch my lips. They had their stolen romance and their temporary, foolish illusion of victory. I held the absolute power to burn their entire world down to ash. I walked swiftly down the long, silent corridor leading to my private study. My heart beat with a steady, exhilarating rhythm of pure victory. I opened my heavy iron safe and placed the signed documents inside. These papers were far more valuable than any diamond necklace in this cursed manor. I sat at my mahogany desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of writing paper. I needed to draft a final, urgent letter to Mr. Vance. I instructed him to officially process the separation of accounts on the morning of the Grand Autumn Ball. I wanted the bank notices to be delivered to William at the precise moment he felt most powerful. He intended to use the ball to informally introduce Victoria to our high society peers. He planned to parade his pregnant mistress in front of the town's most elite families. He thought he could humiliate me in public without facing any consequences. I sealed the letter with red wax and stamped it with my personal crest. My revenge was no longer just a distant dream. It was a legally binding reality sitting safely in my vault. Let them drink the expensive wine tonight. Let them sleep peacefully in the softest beds. The storm outside had finally passed, but the real hurricane was just gathering its strength within these walls. The week leading up to the Grand Autumn Ball passed in a blur of frantic, arrogant preparations. Victoria paraded through the corridors of Sterling Hall as if she were already the true, undisputed mistress of the estate. She barked harsh, demanding orders at the seasoned servants who had faithfully served my family for over 3 decades. William did absolutely nothing to correct her increasingly disrespectful and chaotic behavior. Instead, he encouraged her dangerous delusions of grandeur at every possible opportunity. He ordered the absolute finest tailors in the city to craft a breathtaking gown of emerald silk for her. The heavy, expensive fabric was specifically designed to highlight, rather than hide, the swelling proof of his infidelity. He desperately wanted the entire aristocracy to see the undeniable evidence of his virility. 3 days before the ball, the ultimate insult finally occurred inside my private dressing room. I was sitting quietly before my silver mirror when the heavy oak door was pushed open without a single knock. Victoria stood proudly in the doorway, leaning heavily on William's arm with a deeply feigned look of exhaustion. Her greedy, calculating eyes instantly locked onto the dark velvet jewelry box resting on my polished vanity table. Inside that simple box lay the legendary sterling sapphires, a breathtaking necklace of immense historical value. It was a priceless piece traditionally worn only by the reigning Duchess on the night of the autumn gala. "Eleanor," William began, his voice carrying that familiar, condescending tone of absolute, unquestionable authority. "Victoria's exquisite emerald gown requires a spectacular piece of jewelry to properly complete the ensemble." He did not even bother to ask for my permission. He simply walked over to my vanity and picked up the heavy velvet box with his own arrogant hands. "The brilliant sapphires will look absolutely magnificent against her pale skin," he declared confidently. Victoria gasped in mock surprise, placing a delicate, trembling hand over her heart. "Oh, William, I could never take such a precious, vital heirloom from her grace," she lied beautifully. Her eyes, however, were burning with a ravenous hunger that completely betrayed her modest, gentle words. A sudden, sharp spike of fury flared deep within my chest, but I quickly suffocated it beneath a mask of absolute ice. I turned slowly on my velvet stool and looked calmly at the 2 thieves standing in my private sanctuary. "She is carrying the vital future heir to the noble sterling dukedom," I said smoothly, forcing my lips into a gentle curve. "It is only fitting that she wears the finest jewels to celebrate such a joyous, momentous occasion." William exhaled a loud, heavy breath of relief, clearly thrilled that he did not have to publicly fight me for the necklace. He actually smiled at me, a genuine look of misplaced gratitude crossing his handsome, deeply treacherous face. He completely mistook my strategic, calculated surrender for utter, pathetic emotional defeat. He handed the magnificent sapphire necklace directly to his heavily pregnant mistress. Victoria clutched the glittering blue stones to her chest like a starving animal claiming a fresh, bleeding kill. She looked down at me with a smirk so vicious and triumphant it could have easily cut through solid stone. She truly believed she had successfully stripped me of my final shred of aristocratic dignity. She did not know that the sterling sapphires had already been legally transferred into my untouchable private trust. By wearing them tonight, she was merely keeping my expensive property polished for me. The remaining days quickly evaporated, and the highly anticipated evening of the grand ball finally arrived. Stirling Hall was brilliantly illuminated by thousands of expensive wax candles that I had personally paid for. The grand ballroom was overflowing with the wealthiest, most influential families of the high aristocracy. Dukes, earls, and wealthy merchants mingled beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers, drinking my imported champagne. They whispered constantly behind their feathered fans, absolutely desperate to see the scandalous pregnant mistress. I stood silently near the towering marble fireplace, dressed in a surprisingly simple, unadorned gown of midnight black velvet. I wore absolutely no jewelry, allowing my bare neck to speak volumes to the highly observant crowd. I was perfectly playing the complex role of the humiliated, discarded wife fading quietly into the dark shadows. Suddenly, the loud, booming voice of the head butler echoed across the massive, incredibly crowded ballroom. His Grace, Duke William of Stirling, and his esteemed guest, Lady Victoria. The entire room fell into a sudden, deafening hush as the heavy oak doors swung dramatically open. William stood proudly at the top of the grand staircase, looking exactly like a conquering king in his tailored formal wear. Victoria stood closely beside him, absolutely glowing in the stunning, incredibly expensive emerald silk gown. The legendary sterling sapphires sparkled fiercely around her neck, blinding everyone who dared to look directly at them. A collective, highly shocked gasp rippled violently through the vast sea of noble guests below. To allow a mere mistress to wear the Duchess's ancestral jewels was an unforgivable, catastrophic insult in our strict society. It was a highly public, undeniably brutal declaration of war against my entire family bloodline. William slowly led her down the sweeping staircase, completely ignoring the scandalous whispers echoing loudly around them. He looked straight across the crowded room and locked his deeply arrogant eyes directly onto mine. He wanted me to thoroughly feel the absolute crushing weight of my profound public humiliation. He desperately wanted me to break down, to cry, to run away into the cold, stormy night in utter shame. I did not break. I simply raised my tall crystal glass of champagne in a silent, highly mocking toast to his incredibly fragile ego. Let him fully enjoy the intoxicating, fleeting taste of this stolen, entirely temporary glory. The music began to play, a sweeping, romantic waltz that completely filled the heavy, tense air of the ballroom. William immediately led Victoria to the very center of the highly polished wooden floor. He boldly initiated the vital first dance of the evening with his mistress, completely disregarding centuries of tradition. The aristocratic ladies surrounding me whispered fiercely behind their silk gloves, deeply scandalized by the blatant disrespect. Several prominent lords exchanged uneasy, highly knowing glances, strongly sensing that a major shift in power was occurring. They all firmly believed they were silently witnessing the tragic, entirely permanent downfall of Duchess Eleanor. They deeply pitied my silence, mistakenly interpreting my icy calm for the total paralysis of a broken heart. The grand, antique grandfather clock in the distant hallway chimed clearly, cutting through the beautiful music. It meant the sun had finally set on the bustling financial district in the faraway city. Mr. Vance had ruthlessly executed the final, devastating legal maneuver exactly 3 hours ago. The massive, completely unavoidable financial avalanche had already been officially triggered. Every single copper coin of my vast family wealth had been surgically removed from the sterling accounts. I watched the priceless sapphires catch the warm candlelight as Victoria spun gracefully in William's strong arms. Every single dramatic rotation on that crowded dance floor brought them 1 second closer to their absolute destruction. I could already hear the distant, faint sound of galloping hooves approaching the heavy iron gates of the estate. The official bank messengers were currently riding hard through the night, carrying his absolute ruin securely in their leather saddlebags. The grand romantic waltz reached its breathtaking crescendo just as the violent pounding began. Heavy fists battered relentlessly against the massive oak doors of the grand ballroom. The cheerful orchestra music faltered instantly and died a clumsy, sudden death. Hundreds of elite noble guests turned their powdered heads toward the chaotic noise. William stopped dancing immediately, a deep scowl ruining his handsome, confident face. Victoria clutched his arm tightly, looking around the room like a frightened little bird. The heavy doors were suddenly forced open with a deafening, echoing crash. A sharp gust of freezing autumn wind swept violently into the warm, candlelit room. 6 uninvited men marched directly into the center of the elegant, exclusive gathering. They did not wear the refined silk coats or polished shoes of high society. They wore the heavy leather coats of city bailiffs and ruthless debt collectors. Their muddy boots left ugly, dark stains all over my pristine marble floors. The head bailiff, a tall man with a heavily scarred face, stepped forward. He carried a thick stack of legal parchments sealed with harsh, official red wax. The surrounding aristocrats parted quickly, treating the strange men like a contagious disease. William of House Sterling, the bailiff's rough voice boomed across the completely silent room. William puffed out his chest, desperately attempting to maintain his shattered aristocratic authority. "How dare you interrupt a private gathering of the high nobility?" he demanded loudly. "I demand you leave my estate this very instant before I call the royal guards." The bailiff did not flinch, offering a cold, highly pitying smile instead. "This estate is no longer yours to command, Your Grace," the man replied smoothly. A collective, dramatic gasp rippled violently through the stunned crowd of wealthy onlookers. William's face turned a dangerous shade of purple as he stepped toward the intruder. "You speak absolute treason against a sitting duke," he roared, raising a threatening fist. The bailiff simply unrolled the heavy parchment and began to read the official decree. "By direct order of the Royal Bank and the High Court of Creditors," he announced loudly. "The financial backing of the sterling accounts has been officially and permanently withdrawn. The massive consolidated debt signed by your own hand is now immediately due in full." William froze completely, his raised fist dropping slowly and heavily to his side. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to comprehend the catastrophic, life-destroying words. "That is entirely impossible," William stammered, his voice suddenly losing its arrogant edge. "My wife secured my debts just yesterday with her own massive family capital." He turned his desperate, frantic eyes toward the dark corner where I stood silently. Every single noble guest in the vast ballroom turned to stare directly at me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my imported champagne before stepping gracefully forward. The tight sea of aristocrats parted for me with immediate, deeply fearful respect. I walked calmly until I stood mere inches from my trembling, publicly humiliated husband. "I did not secure your debts, William," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the dead silence. "I simply consolidated them entirely under your own, exclusive personal name. The papers you eagerly signed specifically released my family trust from your reckless liabilities." William stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, his face draining of all human color. The horrifying reality of his catastrophic mistake finally crashed down heavily upon his shoulders. He had blindly signed away his only financial safety net simply to impress his mistress. "You lied to me," he whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic, sudden weakness. "I presented a legal contract, and you arrogantly chose not to read it," I corrected him coldly. "A duke should truly know better than to sign a document he does not understand." Victoria released a sudden, high-pitched wail of pure terror from behind him. She realized instantly that the luxurious, golden dream she had stolen was violently collapsing. She took a quick step backward, desperately trying to hide behind William's broad shoulders. The bailiff's sharp eyes immediately snapped toward her frantic, panicked movement. More specifically, his cold eyes locked onto the glittering blue stones resting against her chest. "The official court order also mandates the immediate seizure of all unshielded assets," the bailiff stated. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at the terrified, heavily pregnant woman, including the stolen jewelry currently resting on that young woman's neck. Victoria clutched the legendary sterling sapphires tightly with both of her trembling hands. "No," she screamed, completely dropping her carefully crafted facade of delicate innocence. "These absolutely belong to me now because William gave them to me." The bailiff shook his head slowly, pulling another piece of parchment from his heavy coat. "Those specific ancient sapphires are legally registered to the private trust of Lady Eleanor. They are not the property of this bankrupt estate, nor are they a cheap gift for a mistress. Hand them over peacefully, or my men will be forced to physically remove them from you." Victoria looked at William, tears of absolute rage and deep panic streaming down her flushed face. "Do something to stop them, William," she shrieked, stomping her foot loudly on the marble floor. "You are a powerful duke, so tell these filthy men to leave us alone." But William could not speak, nor could he move a single muscle to defend her honor. He was completely paralyzed by the crushing, suffocating weight of his absolute public destruction. The wealthy peers he had invited to witness his triumph were now eagerly watching his execution. They whispered viciously among themselves, already distancing themselves from a totally ruined man. Two large, rough deputies stepped forward and easily grabbed Victoria by her shaking arms. She fought them like a cornered wild animal, completely abandoning all aristocratic decorum. They expertly unclasped the heavy sapphire necklace and pulled it smoothly away from her skin. The priceless jewels were handed directly back to me by the highly respectful head bailiff. I held the cold, beautiful stones in my palm, feeling a profound sense of total victory. I looked down at William, who had helplessly collapsed onto his knees in the center of the room. The supposedly powerful Duke had been reduced to a pathetic, broken beggar in mere minutes. "Pack your personal belongings tonight, William," I commanded, my voice devoid of any human sympathy. "The angry creditors will begin seizing the actual furniture by tomorrow morning." I turned my back on them both and walked gracefully toward the grand staircase. The glorious autumn ball was officially over, and my beautiful new life had finally begun. The sun rose slowly over Stirling Hall, but it brought absolutely no warmth to the freezing, chaotic morning. Rough, unfamiliar voices echoed loudly through the once peaceful, deeply historic marble corridors. The ruthless debt collectors had not waited a single extra hour to begin their highly profitable work. They marched heavily up the grand sweeping staircase carrying massive, empty wooden crates. I stood quietly on the upper balcony, wearing a warm, beautifully woven cashmere morning gown. I held a steaming cup of imported tea and calmly watched the total dismantling of my husband's fake life. Two large, muscular men carried the heavy mahogany dining table straight out the front door. Another group violently ripped the expensive silk curtains right off the tall, elegant windows. They were systematically stripping the historic estate completely bare to satisfy the massive outstanding loans. Suddenly, a piercing, deeply hysterical scream shattered the cold morning air. It came directly from the luxurious master suite located in the East Wing. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the source of the terrible, desperate noise. The heavy bedroom door was wide open, revealing a scene of absolute, poetic devastation. Three stern city bailiffs were ruthlessly emptying the large, carved wooden wardrobes. Victoria was standing in the very center of the room, her face flushed completely red with rage. She was wearing only a thin, plain cotton nightgown that offered no protection from the autumn chill. She clutched desperately at the beautiful emerald silk dress she had worn so proudly the night before. A tall bailiff grabbed the other end of the expensive fabric and pulled it with sudden force. "The city tailor reported this garment is entirely unpaid for," the man stated with a cold, deadpan voice. "It legally belongs to the Merchant Guild now, not to a bankrupt Duke's mistress." He yanked the dress roughly from her hands and tossed it carelessly into a dirty canvas bag. Victoria fell heavily to her bare knees, weeping loudly over the sudden loss of the expensive silk. She did not cry for William, nor did she shed a single tear for their supposedly profound romance. She cried exclusively for the stolen wealth and social status she was rapidly losing. William stood helplessly in the dark corner of the room, looking exactly like a hollow, defeated ghost. His expensive, custom-tailored suits were already being carried down the hallway by the armed guards. Victoria suddenly turned her tear-stained face toward him, her eyes completely filled with raw, unmasked hatred. "Do something, you useless, pathetic excuse for a man," she shrieked loudly at the top of her lungs. "You promised me endless riches and a glorious, undeniable title. You promised I would easily be the most powerful woman in this entire cursed county." William flinched violently at her harsh, deeply venomous words. The delicate, sweet, entirely submissive mistress he thought he loved had completely vanished. Immediate poverty had instantly burned away her beautiful, carefully constructed mask of devotion. She was clearly just a greedy, highly manipulative opportunist who had foolishly bet on the wrong horse. Victoria, Please calm down, William begged weakly, holding out a shaking hand to her. We simply need a little time to recover our social footing and contact my distant relatives. She slapped his outstretched hand away with a vicious, sharply resounding crack. I am carrying a child, and you cannot even provide a warm bed for me to sleep in, she spat fiercely. I stepped quietly into the doorway, allowing the soft rustle of my cashmere gown to announce my presence. The two ruined lovers stopped their bitter fighting and looked up at me simultaneously. William's sunken eyes suddenly filled with a pathetic, deeply nauseating glimmer of false hope. He actually thought I had come to save him from this humiliating, inescapable nightmare. He took a quick step toward me, falling heavily onto his knees right at my waiting feet. Eleanor, he wept openly, grabbing the hem of my dress with dirty, violently trembling fingers. I was a complete fool, and I have made a terrible, entirely unforgivable mistake. I will send her away today, I swear it on my own miserable life. Victoria gasped loudly from the cold floor, entirely betrayed by his cowardly, desperate surrender. You promised you loved me forever, she screamed, throwing a solid silver hairbrush at his back. William ignored her completely, staring up at me with absolute, pathetic desperation. Just pay off the primary creditors so we can at least keep the manor, he pleaded endlessly. We can live quietly in the countryside, just the two of us, exactly like before. I looked down at the weak man I had once sworn to permanently honor and obey. I felt absolutely nothing for him but a cold, highly clinical sense of pure disgust. I calmly pulled the pristine hem of my gown straight out of his desperate grip. You seem to be severely confused about the current financial situation, William, I said smoothly. I reached into my deep pocket and pulled out a fresh, heavy parchment document. It was officially stamped by the Royal Courts and the powerful City Banking Guild. Mr. Vance visited the primary debt holders late last night on my specific, strict orders. My private trust legally purchased every single one of your defaulted loans. I did not pay your debts to save your reputation. I bought your debts so I could personally foreclose on this very estate. William stared at the legal paper, his jaw dropping open in absolute, unadulterated horror. I am the sole, indisputable legal owner of Sterling Hall and all its surrounding lands, I continued coldly. You do not own a single blade of grass on this entire property. And I absolutely do not permit bankrupt, deceitful strangers to reside in my home. The head bailiff stepped forward, placing a heavy, unforgiving hand tightly on William's shoulder. You heard the absolute lady of the house, the rough man ordered firmly. You have exactly 5 minutes to leave the premises before we physically throw you out. William desperately tried to speak again, but only a dry, choking sound escaped his ruined throat. He finally understood the absolute, inescapable depth of the lethal trap I had built for him. He slowly dragged himself up from the floor, completely broken in both body and spirit. He walked blindly out of the bedroom, not even bothering to look back at his pregnant mistress. Victoria scrambled frantically to her feet, realizing she was about to be left completely behind. She grabbed a thin, highly inadequate wool shawl and ran out the door, chasing after the ruined Duke. I followed them both down the grand staircase at a leisurely, highly relaxed pace. The heavy front doors were standing wide open to the cold, violently biting autumn rain. The bailiffs practically pushed them both out onto the wet, muddy gravel of the long driveway. They had no carriage, no fast horses, and absolutely no money to their damaged names. Let me back inside. Victoria suddenly screamed from the wet gravel, pounding her fists against the stone steps. I am pregnant with the future heir, and you cannot leave me out here in the freezing cold. I did not even blink at her pathetic, entirely self-inflicted misery. You are pregnant with a useless bastard sired by a penniless beggar, I corrected her coldly from the dry threshold. The royal law offers no shelter for your incredibly poor life choices, and neither do I. William tried to reach for the brass door handle, his face completely pale and deeply drawn. "Eleanor, at least let me take a horse from the stables," he begged, his teeth chattering loudly. "We will freeze to death on the long, brutal walk back to the city." I offered him a sharp, entirely unsympathetic smile that did not reach my eyes. "The horses belong exclusively to my trust, William, and they are far too valuable to be ridden by common vagrants." I signaled to the tall iron gates located at the very far end of the long driveway. "I highly suggest you start walking quickly before the storm gets significantly worse." The loyal estate guards stepped forward, raising their heavy wooden pikes to officially block his path. William finally realized that every single ounce of mercy in my heart had completely died the night he brought her home. He turned slowly and began to drag his feet heavily through the deep, wet mud toward the distant road. Victoria followed him closely, weeping hysterically, and continuing to scream horrible insults directly at his back. They were a truly pathetic sight, completely stripped of all their false dignity and unearned arrogance. I stood perfectly dry in the grand doorway, quietly watching them fade into the grey, violent storm. I slowly and deliberately closed the heavy oak doors, completely shutting them out of my life forever. The loud, deeply satisfying thud of the iron lock engaging echoed beautifully throughout the completely silent hall. My massive house was finally completely clean, and my bright future was entirely my own. 3 brutal months passed, bringing the harshest winter the capital city had seen in decades. Freezing winds howled through the narrow, filthy alleyways of the lower merchant district. William pushed open the rotting wooden door of a cramped, heavily drafty boarding house room. His once immaculate hands were completely covered in bleeding blisters and deep layers of thick soot. The former Duke of Stirling now shoveled dirty coal at the city docks just to buy stale bread. He stepped inside the freezing room and immediately heard the familiar, grating sound of harsh weeping. Victoria was huddled on a thin, uncomfortable mattress pushed directly into the darkest corner of the room. Her heavily pregnant belly was painfully large under the cheap, thin wool blanket she clutched to her chest. The beautiful, alluring mistress he had risked his entire dukedom for had vanished entirely. She looked up at him with sunken, bitter eyes that held absolutely no trace of human love. "You are late again, and there is no firewood left," she snapped violently, her voice raw and hoarse. "I worked an extra shift at the harbour so we could afford a small piece of salted meat," William replied wearily. He dropped a tiny, heavily wrapped paper parcel onto the wobbly wooden table. Victoria stared at the pathetic meager ration with utter, undeniable disgust. "I was supposed to dine on roasted pheasant served on solid silver platters," she cried loudly. "I was supposed to be the most powerful, respected Duchess in the entire southern province." William closed his eyes tightly, completely unable to bear the endless, repetitive sound of her daily complaints. He finally realized that she had never truly loved his heart or his supposed aristocratic charm. She had only loved the massive, deeply protected vault of my family bank. They were hopelessly trapped together in this freezing, miserable hell of their own making. William slowly unwrapped the salted meat, his broken fingernails catching sharply on the rough paper. He offered a small piece to the woman who currently carried his unborn, entirely doomed child. Victoria slapped his dirty hand away, sending the precious food tumbling directly onto the dusty floorboards. "I would rather starve than eat the pathetic scraps of a ruined beggar," she screamed fiercely. William stared at the fallen meat, a dark, heavy silence suddenly filling the freezing room. He slowly sank to his knees and picked up the dirty food, eating it himself in total, crushing defeat. He remembered the magnificent feasts I used to prepare for him out of simple marital duty. He remembered the absolute warmth of the grand fireplaces he had so foolishly taken for granted. A single, pathetic tear rolled slowly down his soot-stained, completely hollow cheek. He had traded a kingdom of absolute security for a worthless, toxic illusion of masculine control. Meanwhile, a profound and beautiful peace had settled over the magnificent grounds of Stirling Hall. I transformed the decaying, mismanaged estate into a truly profitable agricultural and trading enterprise. The thick, suffocating gloom of William's constant gambling debts was permanently wiped away from my ledger. Tonight, the grand dining room was completely filled with bright, warm candlelight and genuine laughter. I was hosting a private, exclusive winter dinner for a completely different kind of high society. I did not invite the idle, gossiping aristocrats who had eagerly watched my temporary public humiliation. I invited brilliant scholars, wealthy industrial merchants, and forward-thinking political leaders. They did not care about the ancient, highly outdated rules of traditional noble bloodlines. They deeply respected my sharp financial mind, my unyielding resilience, and my independent spirit. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a simple, elegant gown of deep crimson velvet. A highly respected foreign diplomat seated to my right raised his crystal glass directly in my direction. To Lady Eleanor, who possesses the sharpest mind and the strongest will in the entire kingdom, he toasted smoothly. The table erupted in genuine, supportive applause that echoed warmly against the historic stone walls. I smiled warmly, taking a deeply satisfying sip of my expensive imported wine. I felt absolutely no remaining anger or lingering sorrow over the pathetic man I had thrown away. He was completely erased from my mind, just like a meaningless smudge of dirt wiped from a pristine window. My vast family wealth was entirely secure, growing exponentially under my direct, careful management. My youth and my lasting beauty were no longer viewed as weapons to be used by a greedy, manipulative husband. They were simply natural extensions of my own undeniable, fully reclaimed personal power. Back in my warm, beautifully lit drawing room, the evening conversation quickly turned to matters of global trade. I smoothly negotiated a highly lucrative shipping contract with a major foreign merchant fleet. My signature alone carried far more undeniable weight in this world than the ruined sterling title ever did. My loyal servants moved quietly around the room, expertly keeping the fires blazing and the crystal glasses full. They served me with absolute, undeniable loyalty because I treated them with fairness and respect. I looked down at the heavy gold ring resting comfortably on my right index finger. It bore my own original family crest, a fierce eagle soaring high above a mountain of solid rock. It was a permanent, daily reminder that I was completely unbreakable. Outside the warm manor, the heavy winter snow continued to fall softly across my vast, legally secured lands. I watched the gentle snowflakes drifting past the tall glass windows with a profound sense of total victory. I had successfully rewritten the tragic, highly predictable destiny of a betrayed, submissive wife. I did not need a powerful duke to validate my existence or protect my noble standing. I was the master of my own magnificent fate, and I answered to absolutely no one. The most violent winter blizzard of the decade violently slammed against the capital city. The freezing wind howled furiously through the broken window of the dark, filthy slum. Victoria screamed in absolute, terrifying agony from the corner of the small, freezing room. The terrible, painful moment of her dangerous early labor had finally arrived. There was absolutely no expensive physician waiting patiently by her warm, comfortable bed. There were absolutely no soft silk sheets to gently ease her profound physical suffering. There was only a dirty, rotting mattress and a completely empty, freezing fireplace. William paced the small, extremely crowded room in a state of total, absolute panic. He had absolutely no money to pay for even the cheapest local midwife in the district. He had desperately begged his poor neighbors for help, but they simply slammed their doors. The harsh reality of extreme poverty had completely crushed their stolen romance. Victoria violently grabbed his torn, dirty coat sleeve with highly trembling, freezing fingers. She fiercely cursed his name with every single agonizing, deeply painful contraction. She loudly blamed him for dragging her down into this dark, frozen, inescapable hell. William looked down at his deeply ruined, heavily blistered, and thoroughly calloused hands. He finally realized the true, utterly terrifying cost of his arrogant, deceitful betrayal. His foolish aristocratic pride had completely evaporated in the direct face of imminent death. He knew there was only one powerful person in the entire world who could save them. He quickly wrapped a thin, completely useless woolen scarf tightly around his freezing neck. He ran blindly out into the heavily blinding, deeply violent, and incredibly deadly snowstorm. The brutal walk back to Stirling Hall took 3 highly agonizing, freezing hours in the dark. The deep winter snow soaked entirely through his thin, heavily worn leather boots. His wet feet grew completely numb from the highly dangerous, creeping winter frost. His lungs burned fiercely with every single sharp, freezing breath he desperately took. He finally reached the towering, heavily reinforced iron gates of the massive country estate. The warm, beautiful glowing lights of the grand manor deeply mocked his current misery. The historic estate looked significantly more beautiful than he ever remembered it being. It was completely free from the dark, heavy, suffocating cloud of his massive gambling debt. He aggressively grabbed the highly freezing iron bars with his bare, bleeding hands. He loudly screamed Eleanor's name directly into the dark, fiercely howling winter wind. The highly loyal estate guards quickly emerged from the warm, heavily protected shadows. They firmly raised their bright, heavy brass lanterns to deeply inspect the noisy, desperate beggar. They barely recognized the highly arrogant former duke beneath the thick layers of dark dirt. William fell heavily to his bruised knees in the extremely deep, heavily freezing snow. He desperately begged the cold guards to fetch the absolute lady of the warm house. He loudly swore he only needed a tiny, completely insignificant fraction of her past mercy. Inside the warm, highly protected manor, I was resting peacefully by a massive, roaring fireplace. My deeply loyal head butler entered the quiet room with a very tight, highly disgusted expression. He politely informed me that my truly pathetic former husband was loudly begging at the gates. He told me the highly broken man was crying exactly like a stray, completely starving dog. A significantly weaker woman might have quickly opened the heavy gates for an unborn child. A highly foolish woman might have felt a sudden, deeply misguided pang of human pity. But my heart had been completely and permanently forged into a block of solid, cold iron. I calmly stood up and smoothly wrapped a thick, incredibly expensive wool fur cloak around my shoulders. I deeply wanted to look him directly in his miserable, highly sunken, and completely defeated eyes. I deeply wanted to deliver the absolute, highly irreversible final blow to his shattered spirit. I walked slowly and highly deliberately down the long, beautifully snow-covered estate driveway. The heavily armed guards parted highly respectfully as I slowly approached the tall iron gates. William looked up at me with fresh, highly pathetic tears freezing rapidly on his dirty cheeks. He looked entirely broken, deeply pathetic, and utterly, permanently defeated by the world. "Eleanor, you must please help us tonight," he sobbed loudly against the heavy, howling wind. "Victoria is currently dying in childbirth in a highly freezing, completely dark slum. We have absolutely no money for a basic doctor or even a simple, warm fire. I am desperately begging you to save my highly innocent, completely unborn child." He quickly reached his dirty, highly trembling hands through the dark, frozen iron bars. He tried desperately to touch the warm, heavily furred hem of my highly expensive winter cloak. I took a highly slow, deeply deliberate step backward, remaining completely out of his filthy reach. I looked directly down at him with an expression of pure, highly clinical, and absolute indifference. "You are currently speaking to the completely wrong woman, William," I stated highly smoothly. My calm, deeply powerful voice easily cut completely through the loud, fiercely howling winter storm. "I am absolutely not a free charity hospital for the highly pregnant mistresses of ruined men." William violently gasped, heavily shocked by my absolute, highly unyielding lack of human warmth. "You cannot simply let a young woman and an innocent baby freeze to death," he wildly cried. You were once a deeply kind, highly devoted, and incredibly loving wife to me. I slowly offered him a highly sharp, entirely unforgiving, and deeply chilling smile. I was perfectly kind until you proudly brought your pregnant whore directly into my home. I was utterly devoted until you arrogantly tried to completely steal my family wealth. You loudly demanded that I quickly step aside and quietly accept my deeply unfair humiliation. This brutally cold winter is simply the highly natural consequence of your own foolish choices. William violently shook the heavy iron gates in sheer, completely unadulterated, desperate panic. I was completely, highly blinded by my own massive, incredibly fragile ego, he loudly screamed. I deeply and permanently regret every single terrible thing I ever did to you, Eleanor. Please, just give me a tiny handful of gold coins to quickly save their highly miserable lives. I slowly and highly deliberately reached directly into the deep, warm pocket of my fur cloak. I smoothly pulled out a single, highly polished, incredibly insignificant copper coin. It was the absolute, undeniably lowest denomination of currency in the entire massive kingdom. I carelessly tossed the highly worthless copper coin directly through the dark iron bars. It landed completely silently in the deep, freezing snow directly at his highly trembling knees. That is the exact, totally precise value of my highly lingering affection for you, I calmly stated. Use it to quickly buy a cheap, highly smoky candle to poorly light her completely miserable grave. William stared directly at the tiny, deeply insulting copper coin with wide, completely horrified eyes. He finally, deeply understood that he had permanently, entirely murdered my human soul. There was absolutely no soft, highly forgiving redemption waiting for him at the end of his journey. You are a truly terrifying, deeply heartless, and completely ruthless monster, he whispered heavily brokenly. No, William, I calmly corrected him, slowly turning my warm, highly protected back to the fierce storm. I am simply a highly intelligent woman who expertly learned exactly how to successfully read a ledger. Your personal, highly toxic account with me is completely, permanently, and fully closed forever. I smartly signaled directly to the highly loyal, heavily armed captain of the estate guard. If this loud, completely worthless beggar ever returns here, you have my strict permission to shoot him. I absolutely did not look back as I walked highly steadily toward my incredibly warm, extremely safe home. The heavy, violently freezing winter wind easily and completely swallowed his final, highly agonizing screams. The total, highly profound silence of the beautiful winter night was completely, permanently restored. Spring finally arrived at Sterling Hall. The legendary rose gardens bloomed with unprecedented, vibrant color. I sat at my mahogany desk, calmly reviewing my highly profitable trade ledgers. My head butler quietly entered the sunlit room carrying a single sealed letter. It bore the official, dreary stamp of the city's central debtors' prison. I broke the cheap wax seal and quickly scanned the brief, highly clinical words. William had quietly perished from a severe winter fever in his dark, freezing cell. He died completely alone, permanently forgotten by the high society he once worshipped. The letter also casually mentioned the ultimate fate of his beloved mistress. Victoria had miraculously survived the difficult birth in the filthy slum. However, she immediately abandoned the newborn child on the cold steps of a local orphanage. She then quickly fled the city on a merchant ship with a wealthy, aging sailor. Their grand, stolen romance had ultimately amounted to absolutely nothing. I did not shed a single tear for my completely ruined former husband. I did not feel a single ounce of human pity for the motherless bastard child. I calmly walked over to the grand marble fireplace and tossed the letter directly into the warm flames. I stood completely still, watching the cheap paper quickly curl and turn into worthless grey ash. That silent, fading ash was the exact, final legacy of a deeply foolish, highly arrogant man. I turned my back on the fire and walked out into the bright, refreshing spring sunlight. My loyal servants bowed deeply with genuine, undeniable respect as I passed them in the grand halls. I stood confidently on the stone balcony, looking out over my vast, legally secured lands. I was no longer the quiet, deeply submissive wife of a treacherous, deceitful duke. I was Lady Eleanor, the absolute, undisputed master of my own magnificent destiny. The heavy, suffocating chains of my tragic past were permanently and entirely broken. My true, glorious life had finally begun.